Today's lecture is about high-dimensional data and how it can be analyzed and visualized. This is like I think a pretty central lecture, because I think most of you that will work with data will eventually use some of these methods that are introduced. So let's go. So I have a quick overview of the presentation. So it's kind of roughly split into three pieces. So first, we're just going to talk about, what is high-dimensional data and data redundancy. And then we'll talk about some dimensionality reduction methods. So how can you get this like complex data into like a more manageable form? And this is specifically talking about principal components analysis. And then we do some hands-on programming. It's basically like a pre-made Jupyter notebook where we can go through the code of some applications. And then there is like the third part is about a variation of these methods, which is specifically embedding of high-dimensional manifolds. And so for that, we'll look at this ISMMS data, which is a pretty cool data set of digits, like handwritten digits. And machine learning tasks will be to predict what the digit is that was written. And it's a good example for these methods like t-SNE and UMAP. And then we have another practical session where we can go through some code. All right, so let's get going. So high-dimensional data and redundancy. So first of all, like what's high-dimensional data? I think most of you probably have come across this in the past, even if you maybe haven't thought about it as high-dimensional. So the most classic way of high-dimensional data, what we can imagine is a vector of numeric values. So in this case, we have a vector of 4 values, even though it says 5 dimensions, it's 4 dimensions. Sorry about that. So this would be a classic case where we perceive this array as a data point, and it has these 4 values associated to it. And then slightly more complicated would be high-dimensional data points that have not only numeric values, but maybe also some like strings or classes and discrete values, something like that. So for example, a person would also be a high-dimensional object because, or like a high-dimensional data point, because in this case, we have 3 dimensions. We have first name, last name, and age. But you can, of course, imagine many other dimensions to a person. And the same with a car. You can have like a make, model year, color, miles it has been driven, and so on. And so usually if you deal with biomedical data, luckily enough, most of the time the data is numeric. So that makes it much easier to deal with from a mathematical point of view. So yeah, so a lot of text. So but in general, just there's some considerations when you deal with high-dimensional data. So there is this statement that like floats around. It's this like curse of high dimensionality, and there's a lot of definitions to it. But to boil it down, it basically says it's hard to work with high-dimensional data, and there's many reasons. Statistically speaking, it's computationally expensive, and often these machine learning algorithms in the past struggled with data that's high-dimensional, but modern algorithms can deal with high dimensions fairly well. So, but curse of dimensionality, high-dimensional data is kind of tricky to work with. So there is a whole field that deals with feature selection, where you try to reduce the dimensionality and remove irrelevant and redundant features. And by that, you improve potentially machine learning model accuracy. And we have some examples where we look at that more specifically. Then obviously model complexity. So the less data you actually have to look at, the easier it is to deal with computationally. So it's that can be pretty relevant if you work with like really large data sets. And we've actually in the lab also run into this issue that if you have extremely high dimensional data, you can't really run queries in real time anymore. They may take like an hour to compute, And if you can do that in a lower dimensional space by not really losing any information, then that's kind of desirable. And then one obvious one is if you want to visualize data, right? So imagine you have 20,000 dimensional data. You can't really visualize that in a graph, right? Because you only have 2 dimensions on your computer screen. So if you're able to reduce this high dimensional data into something 2-dimensional, then it's really good for data exploration, right? So you can then look at the data and like see what's actually going on with your own eyes. And then also data storage processing I mentioned before, that high dimensional data is potentially very large, and depending on your needs, you might be better off just having like a small subset of dimensions to work with. So the central theme of this lecture, and like what kind of enables a lot of these methods, is that there's redundancy in data. And so redundancy really refers to duplicate or highly correlated information between dimensions in your data. So this can happen through many ways, but so for example, we'll show something in a little bit. If you measure a system through in different multiple ways, but they kind of capture the same information, then you get this redundant data in your output. So then redundancy in general can be problematic, right? So because machine learning algorithms have to kind of figure out what's redundant and what isn't. And as I said, it increases computational cost, but it can also potentially lead to overfitting. And it in general makes it hard for you to actually understand what's going on. And then on the good side, redundancy is also really helpful, right? So imagine you have a lot of noise in the system, right? So every data set, when you measure it, has a certain degree of noise. But if you have many ways of measuring the same thing, then you have this redundancy, and that can really help you to remove noise from your data. So the only way is then you have to differentiate. You have to be able to differentiate between the actual signal in your data and the noise in the data that you want to get rid of. So here's a really simple example of 2 variables, x and y. And so these you can imagine as dimensions in our data. So this data is 2-dimensional, like really simple, so not really high dimensional, but this extends to higher dimensions as well. And then each data point, right, is a data point in our data. So I think these plots have 1,000 data points, and they have 2 dimensions. So in the first plot, you can see that the dimensions x and y, they're not correlated at all, right? So there's no redundancy between the two, meaning if I know x, I don't know anything about y, right? So then there could be the case where there's some redundancy between x and y. So then you can see that there is a correlation to be observed, meaning if I know something about x, then I kind of know something about y to a certain degree. And then in the high redundancy case, I really know a lot about y if I know something about x, right? And so in the case of, for example, this high redundancy, you can already imagine that maybe I only need, one of the dimensions. So maybe y is, completely superfluous. And so we could reduce the data by just looking at x. But so that's a pretty naive way of doing it. And so there's better ways. So now a really simple example of how this data redundancy happens is if we have some form of dynamical system, and so a really simple example would be a car driving down a straight road, right? So imagine you're in Texas and the road just goes 100 miles straight and the car moves on that road. So then the important thing to really think about as the road is a 1-dimensional object, right? So it's kind of a line, right? So the road, imagine it as a line. So the car can be described with a single value, which would basically tell you where on the road the car is. right? Does that make sense so far? Okay. So really like a simple system. So now we want to observe this car, right? So this car is moving basically just one-dimensional. What we can do now is we can place a bunch of cameras like on the road, and then each camera is basically looking for the car. So this is like this. So in this case, we have these 3 cameras, right? And they all look at the road in like a slightly different angle. But in the end, they all observe exactly the same thing. They all look at the car and they measure where the car is on the road. And so what's funny, so, you know, since this is like in the real world, the world is obviously 3-dimensional, right? So everything is embedded in like a 3-dimensional world, but the cameras, they capture 2-dimensional data, right? So they will have some 2-dimensional picture and the car is somewhere on that picture, right? So that's at every time point, a camera will give us a 2-dimensional value where the car is in their picture, right? So we get basically a 2-dimensional data point for each camera. Okay. So now what we can think of, if we combine the information of these 3 cameras together into a single data point, then we get a 6-dimensional data point. Okay. So now what that means is we really look at a 1-dimensional thing, right? It's like the position of the car on the road, but through this like redundant measurement of the system, we get a 6-dimensional data point. But so this data point really is just measuring a 1-dimensional thing. And so we can do this in different time steps. And so for each time point, we get a different 6-dimensional data point. And so what we really want is methods that can take these T1 like to T3, Tn, how many there are, and identify really the true underlying dimensions of this data and then dismiss everything else. But so this kind of explains just how we can get this redundancy in data, right? And this extends to a lot of different things. So this would also extend to gene expression data, right? Because in the end, if we measure genes, they're just like cameras, if you want, looking at the program that the cell is running, right? It's like it's in a certain cell state, and then it reacts to certain external stimuli. So the individual genes that we measure are just basically telling us something about the underlying mechanisms that are potentially of a much lower intrinsic dimensionality than the number of genes that we have.